that could be an abiding theme for my work,
Right.
certainly.
Yeah,
And we are good to go.
wonderful. Hello and welcome to yet another edition of Tiffin Talks. I have with me Manreet Sodhi Someshwar, who's done an amazing amount of writing in the past few years, over a decade, I think, Manreet, and across genres. But as we were just discussing, I think the women characters that she writes are the things that stay with us. They're very powerful, very not always perfect, as we are not in real life, perhaps flawed, but very powerful and uh, the kind who make things happen. And who don't just let things happen to them. I think that's what's interesting about her characters. So, hello and welcome, Manreet. You're speaking to us from New York. How has the lockdown been treating you?
Hi, Kaveree. It's lovely to be here on Tiffin Talks with you. I guess the lockdown has been treating me the way it has people everywhere in the world.
Right.
The first 3 months, we were really just sequestered at home, which is my husband, daughter, and me, and with our cat. And I have to say, the biggest shock was for the cat because, she was used to two people leaving home every morning. I work from home. And suddenly she had these three people and the house was too busy for her. So we could see her. She couldn't decide where she wanted to sit for a while. But in the last 3 months, I think New York has done pretty well. I think people have been extremely disciplined about wearing masks. So you just do not step out of the house, like even in the elevators without a mask on. Most everybody's doing that. And people are trying to maintain social distancing. Like you see somebody walking down, you step to the other side. So that has helped, I think. This city was sort of the epicenter for the US of
Absolutely.
COVID,
Yeah.
but I think we beat it down. The governor was leading us all on, cheering us with New York tough, and I think people acted responsibly. So fingers crossed, this is the flu season. There might be another wave, but
Yeah.
we are hoping we can counter it with the masks on. So.
And you have an election coming up, a very key election, which will decide how the country moves forward in the next 4 years. I'm obviously not going to ask you who you're going to vote, but how important are these elections for the Americans?
Oh, they are extremely critical. I think just like a large swathe of the world, which has sort of turned to more authoritarian leaders, and I would say the current president rode that wave too in the US.
Yes.
Just like any other, first world society, this place is also extremely unequal, and there are reasons why, the president got elected. But I think over 4 years, people have been able to see what has happened, and nobody really knows. You always have the pundits telling you how it's going to turn, but
Yeah.
everybody is waiting with bated breath for November 3rd.
Yeah.
So it's extremely critical in terms of a lot of issues and environment,
Right.
health, women's rights, so immigrants. So we will see how easily we breathe come first week of November.
Manjeet, we're here to talk about your new book, which is Girls in the City. It's about these three women in the city of Bengaluru, all working women. The mystery, there's a mystery, of course, and it doesn't quite pan out the way you think it pans out. Even after the conclusion, there's yet another resolution, which is quite interesting. And it's very off the moment, Manreet. In India currently, we're seeing this wave of misogyny, whether it's with the vilification of Riya Chakrabarti with Sushant Singh Rajput's girlfriend, or whether it was the terrible Hathras rape case, which now the authorities are trying to say was not a rape case at all. Your book has echoes of that. And I wonder how, sitting in America, you can have such a finger on the pulse of what's going on in India in a way to write a novel, and which seems just a murder mystery, but it's more than that. It's a social commentary and tells us really where we are going as a nation.
That's an excellent question, Kaveri. It's something I tussle with myself.
Yeah.
So we travel to India every year. I mean, sometimes twice a year, and I have been outside of the country for 20 years. But I think we've always been in touch, going back. Both our sets of parents are there. We have family. And beyond that, I think when I started conceiving this novel, it was 2018. It was the start of the Me Too movement, which, if
Right.
you recall, was from within the US and very much New York City when
Yes.
it started to break. And then I was keenly following how the Me Too movement was coming out in India as well. There was a lot of outrage, there was a lot of women sharing,
Mm.
and then it just died down. It
Yeah.
just went poof. Uh, Unlike here, for instance, it was chased down. There were books written, there were panel discussions, there were talks, and I thought I wanted to write about that. And I wanted to write in a way that would make people read it instead of saying, oh, this is another heavy topic. Do I want to
Exactly. Yeah.
engage with it?
Yeah.
And the way we read, we always want something to help us flip the pages. And
Mm.
a mystery is usually an easy strategic way of doing that. I'm
Mm.
glad you think that there is social commentary woven in it, because that was really the premise I began with. But I was very clear I wanted to have it told in a way that will make people stay with it. And then,
Right.
when you take a pause or you think about it, all those issues are surfacing. And I had just finished work on my previous book, which is The Radiance of a Thousand Suns, which is looks at 70 years of independent India, but
Yes.
through a female gaze. And
Right.
that for me was a big literary work, which had taken a lot
Yeah.
of research. I wanted to write something which was breezier, more contemporary. And it was very clear I wanted to use as my protagonist young working women.
Right.
And how sort of, when you go about your daily life, you catching an auto or a
Mm.
Uber, you're going to work, during the work hours later, and how sort of patriarchy keeps entangling with you,
Yeah.
and how do these women deal with it. So that's the
And even
premise.
the patriarchy, sorry, even the patriarchy of older women.
Oh yes, absolutely. And I wanted to show the various ways in which
Yes.
patriarchy works. And as you point out, here there is Mrs. Rao, who's an elderly
Yeah.
landlady with a fabulous rental accommodation, and yet she has so many restrictions. You
Yeah.
know, and I drew upon my own working experience in India. I worked in advertising, consulting, and marketing, and I have been through so much of this myself. You're a young person, come to a big city, and you're working. As sudden you realize, just because you keep long hours, because hey, you have to work late. I mean,
Yeah.
in advertising, work would start at 4 in the afternoon, so which means
Absolutely.
you're not home before 12 in any case. And then the assumption that you are a loose person,
Yeah.
it didn't make any sense. So I wanted to bring all those frustrations, all those concerns, and also show how women deal with it, with wit, with enthusiasm, with their skill, with nerves, and with with sometimes some amount of giving it back as well. So that's what
Yeah.
I was trying to weave in. I also want to add that though we can think that the US is very different from India, in many ways it is not. Now I've lived here a few years. This is the world's oldest democracy. India is the world's largest democracy,
Right.
and this is a place where the battle for women's rights is still going on,
Hmm.
very much as in India. In India, legally we are same as men, but we
Yeah.
know practically how it's executed.
Yeah.
So I very much feel that women, despite being one half of the world, are the world's largest minority. And
Yeah.
except for some, very halcyonic Scandinavian countries, I feel that's true for women across the world. So I
Right.
hope that this, the book with its themes speaks to women everywhere. Those are
Right.
the
It
concerns that I
does.
was trying to raise.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think, in Juhi Jai especially, you see such a cross section of so many minorities or marginalities, so to speak. Small town comes to a big city, is a woman, seen as provincial. All these are marginalities still in metropolitan India, which is why we see such a backlash against the old elites. Her character was the most fascinating, wasn't it?
Yes. And also the most difficult for me to write, because I
Right.
wanted to show her as a person who, as you say, she comes from a small town in UP. So she's provincial, and she's
In the way
also,
it is seen, Mufassil,
yes.
it's sort of still seen as sort of Hindi
Right.
speaking.
Absolutely. I remember when I went to engineering college, which was in Chandigarh, which is not sort of a megapolis. And still, people would call girls, and there were very few girls in an engineering college per
Yeah.
se, but girls who had come from smaller towns, they would say BTM, Behenji turned modern. And I
Yeah.
just
Now,
say,
yeah.
yeah, one of those cliches, like I show how people call Juhi a certain term, deprecating,
Yeah.
Goriwad.
Right.
So these are things which are sort of casually hurled out at women, who dare to dream. Juhi is a person who has these aspirations, and she wants to join the workforce. She wants to do well, and the misogyny, the patriarchy, the way it acts against her at every stage. I also wanted to show how she is naive, because if you're
Yeah.
21 and you've only seen a small town, you don't know how the world really works in a big city. So it's
Right.
interesting journey for her as she's learning, as she's experiencing things, she's figuring them out for herself, and that informs her choices that she makes in the end, especially.
Right. All your characters, even in your other novels, have been very strong, as I said at the outset. But especially in Radiance of a Thousand Suns, you traverse such a huge span of time, and that whole idea that there's so much unsaid about all the suffering that our mothers and grandmothers have gone through. And except for maybe a few things like Urvashi Bhutalia's book, there's very little that actually women from the partition era have told us. You'd be surprised, Manreet, even until as recently a few days ago, my mother was telling me something about what happened to her during when the raiders came to Baramulla in Kashmir. And she was saying her most stark memory as a 6-year-old was being lined up along with her sisters in the front garden and told by her uncle that when the raiders come, this is how I'm going to shoot you. Here's the gun, and this is how I'm going to shoot you. But imagine it has taken her so many years to tell me something that must have been such a powerful memory for her. So, what is it that, we've, anyway, in partition, the male has told us some, but not enough, I feel, compared to, say, what the Holocaust unleashed, in terms of great literature. Why is it this silence among women? And thank God for writers like you who are writing about it now. Why does it happen?
That's
Sorry
that's
to bring
that's a
in my
deep.
own example, but I was so shocked, Mandeep. I can't tell you. I mean, imagine.
That's a wonderful, wonderful example, Kaveri, and you would be surprised how many such instances
Yeah,
exist, that women that I spoke to, grandmothers that I heard from. It just so to answer your question, it's a very deep one, and it's something I tussled with for a long time, because
yeah.
I grew
Because
up.
sorry, I just want to tell writers that you actually first wrote about this in The Long Walk Home, in a way.
Yes,
And you came
I
back to it because you felt that you hadn't done enough work in that area. So you sort of came back to it. So I want to
yes,
tell readers about that. Yeah.
yeah. Thank you for bringing The Long Walk Home, which is really my first book that I started writing. I did not train to be a writer. As I said, I went to an engineering school, I did my management, and I sold soap and advice and advertising for a while before I started writing. So the reason I started with The Long Walk Home is that I grew up in Firozpur, which is a border town
Right.
on the Indo-Pak border. And during the time of India's partition, it was a Muslim majority town.
Yes.
So by the laws of partition, it should have gone to Pakistan.
Hmm.
But there is huge amount of speculation why it stayed on within India. And so when I was growing up, the very air of the town was suffused with nostalgia.
Right.
I remember so many occasions, I would be eavesdropping and women's conversations would come to some kind of a stop, an unnatural end. The voices would hush and they would come to an end. I could never fathom what the reasons were. The men would talk about it. And I was raised by parents, my father and mother, both of whom were feminists. And in fact, my father's credo while raising us was ask me any question. He was a lawyer. And so anytime I had questions, I would go to him. So
Hmm.
very early on, I started getting sort of the educated in the politics of the subcontinent, the independence partition. And I was growing up, I realized that none of my history textbooks did justice to what I had heard.
Right.
Our history celebrates the independence on 15th August, which is
Not the
great.
partition. Yeah.
Yeah. But there was a partition which happened along with it, in which 1 to 2 million people died. around 15 million people were displaced, and it is regarded as the largest migration, human migration in modern history. And yet, we don't talk about it. Now, to add to that, it is women who bore the brunt of that violence. And so when I was growing up, I had these so many stories in my head, but as I said, I couldn't, find them anywhere. And there was, as a child, you're burdened with math and biology and physics. And so I let them just wash over me. But when I stepped away from my hometown, and I started sort of to think about these things, I could not understand why these were not talked about. And I actually came to Khushwant Singh's Train to Pakistan very late.
Right.
And the moment I read it was like a penny dropped for me. It was like, bingo, here is what I was seeking. Here is something that talks of the experience which I have lived through the lived memories and experiences of my parents and grandparents. And that's when I said, but I grew up during the time of the militancy, the
Yes,
Sikh
of
separatist
course.
movement, the Khalistan movement
Yeah.
in the 80s. So I had seen something else, which to me, because I was older now and looking back, was like a mirror image of what had happened in 47.
Right.
We had these, what in India we call the Anti-Sick Riots of
Yeah.
1984. But really, it was a pogrom.
Yeah.
4,000 Sikhs were massacred in the capital of the world's largest democracy in less than 3 days. How does that happen?
Exactly.
And it was an exact replay of partition. Men were hacked, women were brutalized, children, depending on how young they were and what gender they were dealt with in different ways. And I, for the life of me, couldn't come across any literature that could help me understand this. And that's when my journey started, and I took 7 years and came out with a long walk home.
Hmm.
And then, I wrote 3 more books, but the idea for The Radiance of a Thousand Suns, the idea that I had to tell these stories through women, because I do feel history is his story, the
Yeah.
idea that they were women and
Absolutely.
they faced such incredible choices they had to make to keep their family safe. Like, the incident you mentioned with your mother.
Yeah.
There were so many women who did that to their own daughters. The
Absolutely.
idea that, do I let my daughter be brutalized or
Yeah.
do I let her die with honor? The misguided idea of honor in
On-
our culture, where really honor is vested in a woman's vagina, whereas
yeah.
why should it be? Who says it
Yeah.
should be there? So these were the questions which were there in my mind. And I set out to, in my own way, gather research and gather material. And that's where I came against a huge stumbling block. Because as you mentioned, for partition, we have some data,
Yeah.
very limited on women. There was a justice at that time of the Punjab and Haryana. It wasn't Haryana, it was Punjab High Court, called J.D. Khosla. He wrote a book called Stern Reckoning, which
Mhm.
is one of the few accounts where women witnesses who had witnessed partition were spoken to, and some data was collated, and very brief textual statements are there.
Right.
Of course, Urvashi's work came later and is a phenomenal work which
Yeah.
added to our understanding of partition. But beyond that, what were women's experiences? They were really limited. And since I had grown up in a household, I started to trace my steps back to try and seek women of that generation and people of that generation. And I came up against a huge stumbling block because these are grandmothers.
Yeah.
These are people who have failing memory.
Yes.
And there is this trauma. How do you talk about trauma? These memories have been buried deliberately
Yeah.
for aeons of time. And then I want to sort of start scraping them. So I had so many, misdirections. I came against so much of obstruction. And there were so many times when I got lambasted because people told me, why do you want to bring it up?
Yeah.
It's dead, it's gone. Why do you want to bring it up? To add to that, I was trying to look at, the mirror effect of 47 and 84. And as we know, happens in all what we call communal riots in India.
Yeah.
So I was dealing specifically with 84 because that's something I had seen closely. And there is no literature really. You
Yeah.
can count on one hand the number of books that have been written about it.
I can count just one film, in fact, Amu,
Yeah,
Shonat Bose's film. Very
yeah.
powerful film,
Very
but
powerful film. Very,
hardly anything in popular culture.
right. So again, I came against a block. And in fact, in Delhi, West Delhi, there is a colony called Widows Colony,
Okay.
which is where all the women who survived 1984, the pogrom in Delhi, are settled.
Right.
And this month, on 31st, we will mark 36 years of 1984.
Yeah.
And these women are yet to receive any kind of compensation or restitution. All the children there grew up without fathers.
Mm.
All the children there grew up with stories of how their fathers were killed, were hacked. So imagine if you are a young boy or a young girl growing up with those memories, what do you feel? What do you go through? So to cut a long story short, I met people, I spoke with them, and as happens with memory, and especially suppressed memory and trauma, memory is not a linear sequence. People
Mm.
recall things which are most vivid to them. Many times, the time and place was not making sense. But
Right.
what I did was I would just keep collecting all the data and the research I could. And then once we came to the US, I actually enrolled in trauma studies to understand what trauma is. How do our bodies and minds process it? How do we decode it as a researcher, as a person, as a writer interested in it? How do I decode it? It's only after that that I started to get a sense of what these memories were and how could I crystallize them and
Right.
how could I use them to show, what we had gone through, what the women of this subcontinent had gone through in 70 years. So this is just just the sort of the tip of the iceberg of data, stories, research that I had to go through to sort of come to radiance, because finally I want to tell a story. I want to tell a
Yeah.
novel. And a novel cannot reek of research. It has to tell the story, it has to draw me in.
Yes.
So I was very clear that I would tell the stories through my women protagonists, and
Mm.
which is why there is Dadima, who's BG,
Yeah.
Noora,
Nora.
Nikki, Jyot, and Meher. So three generations of women to tell this sort of, and I center it on a family
Yeah.
so that I can crystallize that story through that family. And there is. I studied with a teacher. She's a Columbia University professor and an American writer called Sadia Hartman, and she has come up with something which is called critical fabulation.
Mm-hmm.
And that was exactly what I needed to tell the story, because in critical fabulation, what a writer is doing is that you're using a semi non-fiction approach to tell stories. What you're doing is you're bringing all these data and research, and the way you bring it to the surface is that you string it in a fictional narrative.
Mm.
So I couldn't have written that without talking to so many women or reading the stories of so many women who recounted incidents like the kind your mother did. I
Yeah.
would not have been able to write that. But that was what I was trying to do. That if today there's a young woman who's reading about independence come 15th August, I want to give her this book and say, read this. Maybe this will give you a sense of what your aunt or your grand aunt or your grandmother went through, or stories that they talk at times and you're not interested in. This may give some depth and background to it. So that was really my mission with the book, with the Radiance of a Thousand
And
Suns.
I can imagine it must have touched a chord in so many people. Talk a little about the reaction from across the globe.
Yeah. So it really has been heartwarming when I have get these emails,
Yeah.
or get tagged on Instagram posts, but really young women, young girls, who tell me that they read this book and how much they have fallen in love with a certain character, and more often than not, it is Noora. And
Nora.
I'm so thrilled with it because Noora is a woman in whom I poured all my uh, all the love and joy that I saw in women who supported me when I was growing up. So it was not one person, but I grew up in a feminist household among very strong women, and not just Sikh women, because in Punjab, in any case, there is it's half Hindu, half Sikh. People, I don't know why, tend to think of Punjab and they equate it to Sikh. I mean,
Yeah,
Sikh
which
is
is
one part of the state.
exactly.
Yeah, and as I said, I grew up in a border town, so and my father's family are agricultural people, so we had farms, and a lot of the people on the farm were Muslim. So we had help who was Muslim. In fact, like in those days, uh, we had a Muslim family who raised me. Really, they worked in the house. The husband worked on the farm. The wife worked at house, and her name was Kammo. And so Noora is sort of based off Kammo, but a lot of other women as well, whose stories I try to pour into Noora, because I wanted to show young women that you can be like this.
Yeah.
And I like how Noura is such an iconoclast, and she says that women don't need religion.
Yeah.
Men need religion, because
Yeah.
religion is like, you need religion, you need the faithful, you need an army of faithful.
Yeah.
Women don't need that. For woman, being a woman is religion enough, She has the power to create.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to bring that through. And I'm so touched when people write to me and talk about how much they feel they cannot get Noura out of their heads. And I say, don't. Let her stay in your head.
Yes.
So yeah, it's been wonderful.
Yeah, and Manreet, even in your two other thrillers, the Taj Conspiracy and the Hunt for Kohinoor, you weave in history and the alternative history that is now being propagated as well. For
Yeah.
instance, that Taj Mahal was built by Hindus, which is P.N. Oak's theory. Again, this is something that is so off the moment, this whole idea that we have two versions of history, and the history that's been taught to us, as you said, is not complete. But the theory in India currently is that it was deliberately and mischievously done, so that we have a certain view of history that doesn't demonize the other as it should. So
Mm.
that is currently where we are, that we are in the process of revising our history and demonizing the other in all aspects. I mean,
Right.
there's no redeeming feature.
Right.
How do you look at that? Because your work is so much of research into history as well, and looking at the past and how it influences the present.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for asking that question. I think that is an attempt to answer that question is why I write, really.
Yeah.
And I do trace it back to the town I grew up in, the experiences I had whilst growing up. And one, demonization of the other, creating this other, led to 47.
Yes.
It led to 84, to the demand for a sort of a pure state, because Khalistan is a state of the pure, Pakistan was a state of the pure.
Oh.
And the astonishing thing is that finally, we in the entire subcontinent owe ourselves to the Indus Valley civilization,
Yes.
right? That's where we've come from. And if you look at the Indus, it's a every season, every monsoon, every season, fresh silt is deposited. It's an alluvial base. There is nothing pure about it. Every year there is a churn. And I feel that is such a strong metaphor for who we are as a people. I mean, whether, it is people been coming via conquest, people coming to trade, the monks, people coming for, to teach the message of love. Nanak actually walked. He was the greatest sort of peregrinator of his time. He walked on foot all the way to Mecca in
Yeah.
Arabia and all the way to Nepal and spreading the message of love. So the idea of the other, I think, is a very handy tool to split us, to divide us. It's a popular way to gather votes. But anybody who has any reckoning of their own history and Indian history will know the dangerous path it leads us down to. And I saw it while growing up. I mean, I suddenly, overnight, neighbors, like, as I said, we grew up, I was growing up, our neighbors on one side were Hindus, on the other side were Sikhs. We were a Sikh household. And suddenly these partition lines started to be drawn all over again, because hey, somebody decided that he wanted to carve out another state of the pure out of Punjab, which had already been divided to create
Yes.
Pakistan.
Right.
And I think we have to be aware of these fault lines and remember that there is no other in this story, really. And the other example I like to give is that, for instance, when the Holocaust happened, there were 6 million Jews who died.
Hmm.
And to this day, and I live in New York City, which has a very large, vibrant Jewish
Jewish
community. To
population.
this day, they talk about it.
Hmm.
They will not forget it. To the extent that, if you follow the Booker Prize list or the Book Awards prize list, there is a stunning work which comes every year, which gets nominated.
Right.
Because these people will not forget, and rightly so. I think in India, when we take, so my question used to be, why do we not memorialize partition? Why
Yeah.
do we not talk about it? But in India, the situation gets complicated because when the riots happened post-partition, or the killings happened, it's not that we had a clear enemy. We
Yeah.
became each other's enemy.
Enemy. Yeah.
Citizens turned upon citizens. Neighbors turned upon neighbors. The incident when you mentioned your mother is a 6-year-old being
Yeah.
told
Yeah.
by her uncle that she'll be shot, because where is the enemy coming from? It's the neighbor
Yeah.
who's become the enemy. And I think that is the difficult part. That is the understanding we need to arrive at, the fact that there is no other. It is all us. We are all in this together. There is no other. There is no Nazi amongst us who's
Yeah.
trying to kill us. We are creating the Nazis amongst us. And I think we need to be aware of that, be very consciously be aware and working against it. And I think history, for instance, we just have to go back to our stories, to literature, to the conversations with our grandparents who may remember, or aunts or uncles or neighbors who know this, to understand how this came about and how fruitless it was, because there is no end to it.
Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
just because you mentioned the long walk home, Radiance, and I just want to put it out there that I have been carrying the demons of partition with me for so long that I'm now working on a partition trilogy. And
Oh,
I'm really hoping that at the end of it, I have exorcised myself of them. And I'm putting it out there because the trauma of these stories, the trauma of these lived experiences, I want to bring them on the written page. So anybody wants to sort of say, oh, this person is the other, I say, hey, read this book. Just go. Go read this book. And at the end, you still want to do it fine, you know.
but Manreet, carrying these stories in you, you talked about enrolling for trauma studies. Carrying these stories within you must have been very, very traumatic, and still must be, isn't it? All those memories that people trusted you enough to give you, in a sense, a part of their lives, and you're carrying all that pain and suffering can be terrible, isn't it?
It is. It is. I think I became aware during the long walk home that I was embarking on a journey which was not going to be easy.
Yeah,
And if when you become a repository of stories, there is a fate that you have to execute.
yeah,
There is a promise that has to be kept. So there are various ways I think I try to deal with it. I think one is that even when I tell these stories, I try and tell them through a prism of love,
hmm,
through a prism of community,
yeah,
of people bonding together. That is very important,
yeah,
because I don't think there is any suffering where there is no love.
yeah.
Ghalib said, "कह दे हयात बंदे गम, असल में दोनों एक है,
What does
मौत
it
से
mean?
पहले." So he says, "कह hayat." Kede hayat is the sort of the imprisonment of life. Kede hayat, bande gum, the bondage of pain. असल में दोनों एक हैं. They're really the
They're
same.
really the same.
The same. मौत से पहले आदमी गम से निजात पाए क्यों? Like before death, there is no separation from sorrow.
Right.
And separation, sorrow and love, they go together. So my attempt is always through these stories to tell it through a prism of love and friendship, so people can reflect on how one and the other work together. And
Right.
also, what I try to do on my own mental health level is that every time I finish a big book, I write something which I think is more breezier. But
Cheerful.
yeah, I end up going down the rabbit hole of history. History is
Yeah.
a passion; I can't do without it. So even
Yeah.
for the Taj Conspiracy and the Hunt for Kohinoor, I did a lot of research because I wanted to debunk that idea, that stupid notion that the Taj Mahal is constructed by, whatever, is a Shiva temple or some kind of temple. And actually, I did so much research. When I started doing that, I realized that we don't, we don't have measurements of the Taj Mahal. It
Yeah. You
was,
were saying only Ebba has it
yes, so
apparently.
Edward Cork was the first person to
Yeah.
do it sometime in
Can
the
you imagine?
1980s. And I reached out to Ebba Cork because I read her magnificent book, which gave me so much insight into, that time, the
A
architecture,
lovely
the
book. Yeah.
construction. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then I reached out to her saying, this is what I am aiming to do. And I'm going to really research off your book a lot. And she was, yes, go ahead, do it.
Yeah. Take it.
And yeah, and I love it when people write to me and say, I went to visit Taj Mahal and I took the Taj Conspiracy along, as a guidebook. Because you know what kind of guides we have at the Taj,
Yeah.
right? So I feel so thrilled. And whenever somebody tells me this thing is started again, I say, go read the book, please. You know, and it's a thriller. It's an easy read. You should be able to go through it.
Right.
So yeah, that's my mission, to engage with our history, to get people to read our history, and hopefully then make an informed choice.
Yeah. That's your other trilogy that's pending, isn't it?
Yes.
So is
So
that happening too?
yeah, you know what? So in 2014, I was working on book 3 of the Merunissa trilogy, and my husband
Talk
upended
a
all
little
my
about
plans.
Merunissa so that people can, relate to who she is as well.
Yeah, so Merunissa is the protagonist of my Merunissa trilogy. Book 1 is the Taj Conspiracy, book 2 is the Hunt for Kohinoor, and book 3 is Work in Progress. And Merunissa is half Persian, half Sikh.
Yeah.
And when I started thinking of her, I hit upon this idea that I wanted her to be the physical manifestation of the Taj Mahal. You know,
Right.
so I wanted somebody. You know, it's difficult to feel for a building, but if there is a way for me to transform that building into a person, then it becomes easier to make the connect. And obviously, I don't say Taj Mahal equals Merunissa. It's through the book as I weave it that a
Yeah.
person who feels for her, feels for Taj, feels for that connection, would understand what she's doing. And she's a historian. She's lived her life mostly outside of India, and then she comes to Delhi. I won't give the sort of the critical things away.
She's a fascinating character. Also, Myrunissa is Mumtaz Mahal's original name, isn't it?
Yes,
So
yes,
that's the other
exactly,
connection.
exactly. And yeah, so and you know that's so I was working on book 3 when my husband sort of just upended our plans because we relocated to the US.
Okay. You were
And New
in
York City,
Singapore earlier.
we were in Hong Kong at that time.
Okay.
Yeah, but we were in Singapore, Hong Kong, and then we came here. And you know, New York is great, but finally you have to jhadu pocha bartan. You know, you have to do it yourself. Help is difficult. It's difficult to find good help. And my daughter was just starting what they call middle school here or junior high. So it took me forever to sort of settle down. And then once I had the idea of the book, which was Radiance finally, it started niggling at me. I think it was something to do with being in a place which is completely different. The
Right.
stimuli was different. And I would get into a yellow cab and the driver would say, Hanji, kidan. And suddenly I'm like, gosh, you know, there is a statistic, which is that New York City cabbies, the most popular first name is Mohammed, the most popular last name is Singh. So, you know, there are people who either come from Africa or they are Sikhs from Punjab.
Right.
And and there's a large diaspora. And then I started hearing about stories about 9/11. And, you know, one of the first victims, in fact, the first victim of 9/11 in the US was a Sardar.
Oh,
Yeah, it was a Sikh man, because for a lot of white Americans, the idea of a turban is that
yeah.
that person is an Arab. And this idea that I had been carrying with me of rewriting the 70 years of independent India history through women started surfacing because I heard stories of women and men and how they survived the hate post 9/11. And I thought maybe I can carry the arc from 47 all the way to 9/11 and across continents, because
Right.
you know the diaspora is a very large part of who we are. We're justifiably very proud of Sundar Pichai, but
Hmm.
there are also people like these cabbies
Yeah.
and these women who work in houses and people who do food deliveries and who, suddenly, like it happened in 1984, had to cut their beards, take off their turbans because hey, they were being seen as Arabs. And so that's how I, started to work with that idea, and it took me 5 years. So Merunisa Book 3 therefore got placed to the side, but I am working on it, and I hope to, sort of have it out at some point in time. So fingers crossed.
The other thing I wanted to talk to you about, Manreet, which is sort of not related, but in a way perhaps it is. During the lockdown in India, especially, we saw the Sikh community being amazing, as they always are, but particularly during the lockdown, really being where migrants could come and have a hot meal, where they no questions were asked, meals were just provided for. during the anti-CA and NRC riots. They would go to where the women were, give them again hot meals, regardless of what their religion was, regardless of what they were protesting about. What is it among this wonderful community that sparks this idea of service? Is it because of the kar seva that you have to do, or what is it that makes you so communal in a good way, not in the
Yeah.
way that we understand in India?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it has to go back to the very idea of being a Sikh and what Sikhism is. So Sikh
Yeah,
really is a disciple. It's a shikshak. That is a Sikh is always a student, is a disciple. And the very idea of Sikhism, arose with Guru Nanak as a bridge between sort of the polytheistic Hinduism and monotheistic Islam. And Nanak was looking to provide a bridge where people could sort of connect and say, there is in the end only one God, which is
right.
Ekumkar, how the prayer starts. And the very idea of being a Sikh was in being in a community.
Yeah,
For instance, in Sikhism, the priests do not remain celibate. The
yeah,
idea in Sikhism is to be part of the community. So you
yeah,
marry, you have children, you be an integral part of the community, and you try and lead the community towards greater strength and unity and harmony.
right.
And woven within all that are the facets of Kar Seva, which is really, doing service, helping others.
Hmm.
And the idea of langar, which is the communal kitchen.
Yeah,
So, whoever you are, you can go to a gurdwara and get a hot meal.
yeah,
There will be no questions asked. And I think it's a revolutionary idea. The idea of in a society which is so stratified on caste and class, the idea that just about anybody can walk into a gurdwara and have a meal, it was revolutionary for its time and continues to be revolutionary even today. So in fact, I take a lot of strength and support from the fact that I grew up in a Sikh household. That I'm not really a practicing Sikh. In many ways, I'm an atheist, but culturally, I am a Sikh. I am all for all these values, and it's a very secular religion.
yeah,
At its heart, women are equal to men. Of course, in the practice, at times it gets vitiated, but it is a very secular, very modern faith. In fact, I like to call it as a faith because all its tenets are based on the premise that the three essential premise of Sikhism are kirat karo, vand chako, naam japo. Kirat karo is work hard. So that's the
right,
first premise. Whoever you are, you work hard.
right,
Vand chako is share with others what you have.
right,
And naam japo, and meditate. Think of
right, right.
God, spirituality, be engaged, have a spiritual life, think beyond yourself. And those are the basic tenets that
Absolutely.
anybody can work with. And
Right.
to that extent, the story goes that even when Akbar came and for the langar, and he sat on the ground and ate with ordinary people. This is Akbar the great emperor. And I think in many ways Akbar was great because he had such a syncretic vision and he understood the vision of the Sikh gurus as well. So I'm so happy whenever I hear of these incidents. Even in Syria, for instance, there has been
Oh, yes.
a community of Sikhs who has been working
Yeah.
with the camps, with providing
Right.
relief, and it's extraordinary. I mean, it tells me that there is so much more that I have to do as a Sikh, as a fellow, Sikh, and that if nothing else, in these vitiated times, it shows us that there is another way to be.
Absolutely. When Manreet, you left India, what, about 20 years ago, if I'm not
Yes,
mistaken? Yeah,
right.
it was still a very hopeful country. We're talking about, say, beginning of the 2000s. We seemed to have it all together. We were poised to become one of the biggest economies of the world, and there was a lot of hope and optimism in the air. And we'd beaten our IT guys had beaten the Y2K and all that, and um, you know, even culturally, Lagan was coming out, and there was a lot of excitement in the air. When you look at India now, it's not the same place. Does it worry you?
Yes, it worries me immensely. It worries me immensely because of all the things that I think growing up in India that I had learned to cherish,
Yes.
and all the things growing up I had learned to be sort of forewarned against. As I said, I grew up with memories of 47. I saw the 80s and 84 happening. I'm also that generation where, I went to the IMs and we rode the wave of liberalization of an opening economy. And
Absolutely.
suddenly Baywatch on TVs, screens filling up with all that.
Yeah.
And it seemed at that time as if the world was there for
Yeah.
us Indians to conquer.
Absolutely.
It
Yeah.
was such a hopeful time. And I feel that India and large swathe of the world has reached a point where we have to do something so that it doesn't become a point of no return. We
Yeah.
have to turn the clock back in so many ways. And I feel that in the end, while we have all these global statements, what is it that I, as a person, as an individual, can do? And I feel that I can express my thoughts, share my thoughts through writing, through the stories that I tell. I always tell my daughter, who has grown up outside of India and grown up with a mother such as myself, and she always has these like, how this is so misogynistic, this is so patriarchal. When we discuss certain issues, whether it's here or in India or in the UK or elsewhere. And I always tell her that, we can change patriarchy one story at a time,
Yeah.
one narrative at a time. It's the stories we tell. And I really feel that as a people, we have to shatter the silences that we keep,
Yeah.
whether it's the silences amongst women, it's the silences amongst communities, it's the silences in the same family, in the neighborhoods. We have to start speaking up.
Yeah.
We have to start sharing what our concerns are, because when you really start talking to people, we're not different.
Yeah.
We're not so different. In fact, Ashish Nandi, who's sort of one
Yeah.
of our preeminent sociologists, they had this very interesting research that he did. And I will just recall a bit of it. He was in Chennai, and I think his research team went to people and asked them, who is their personal god, where they were trying to differentiate the personal God from the faith this person belongs to. For instance, I can be a Sikh, but my personal God can be Guru Nanak and Jesus Christ. Like,
Yeah.
and it is in a sense that I went to a Catholic school, so
Yeah.
when I do my prayers, I do the cross. Because
Exactly.
that's the way.
We still, I still do.
Same, yeah, I do it. And I realized when my daughter pointed out to me when she was 3, 4, she was like, "What are you doing?" It was such an unconscious part of me.
Yeah.
So Mr. Nandi's team spoke to people, and the answer was that for a lot of, and the demographic was largely what is the Hindus, the Hindu faith or Hindu religion. And a lot of people, a large majority, counted Mother Mary or Jesus Christ as a personal God.
Interesting.
And it is interesting. And that is the thing with India. I think each one of us has so many layers woven into us that to split us just by a religious identity, which, as we're talking about, again is so layered.
Yeah.
A person can believe in more than one. And why not? The the Hinduism as a faith itself has so
So
many
many
gods and
gods.
goddesses and people to believe in.
Yeah.
So who is there to say that there is only one divine entity? Okay, in the end there is, but the physical incarnation doesn't have to be one. So I do feel that all these conversations, if we start having with each other, we will realize, oh, I like this, you like this too. The idea that we're common on so many platforms. And even like during the research on partition, when again, Mr. Nandi has done a lot of work
Yeah.
on partition research, speaking to the survivors,
Yeah.
and he had a fascinating case where a person, and I use this case even in The Radiance of a Thousand Suns. I gave him a fictional name, but one of the perpetrators of the killings that happened during partition later confided that he misses so much going to, and this was a Hindu, he misses so much going to the mosque in the neighborhood that he grew up in, because on certain evenings it was a Sufi dargah. They
Right.
would go and listen to in Park Patan, they would go and listen to the Sufi music and the Qawwalis. And that
Yeah.
was what he missed so much. And this person is sort of a flag bearer for the saffron movement now. So the idea that we have all these layers and there is no neat partitioning of anything, and there doesn't need to be. And I think stories and literature is a good medium to bring that grayness in us, the idea that there is no black and white, the idea that it all is together. So I feel, as I said, that is my mission, to tell stories which engage and hopefully inform people as well. And we all have to do, our dharma.
Yeah.
The Gita says dharma is karma in action. So there is no point talking these big ideologies unless we actually act them out.
Right.
Um,
So for you, writing really is your dharma. I mean, you live for it. You sort of breathe it day in, day out. You've forgotten how to sell soaps and coffee and chocolates and all that, or I'm sure you can still do it if asked.
yeah, well, writing is my dharma, very much so, and my karma. I'll tell you, the joke in our household is that if dinner is bad, oh, Amma had a bad writing day. To that extent it is. Yeah, I mean, once you sold, started with Hindustan Lever, which is now Unilever India,
Yeah.
selling soaps. Once you've sold Lifebuoy and Lux, you never forget it. So I use those skills
Why is
to
that? Why is that?
because in Unilever, certainly at that time, so I started as an area sales manager in training. So the training was a 15-month period, and really you start at the lowest rung. So you start as a salesperson whom I will finally sort of be in
Right.
charge of. So I would actually go with a register. At that time, we didn't have laptops, and with a register, a pen, and I had to do 40 stores in a day. And Lifebuoy Mangta, Lux Mangta, 150 gram. I had to do that because
In how
hard
many
work.
cities? How many
But
cities?
I did it in Bombay and then I did it in Gujarat. So I was a sales executive, which is the lowest rung in Bombay Metro. So I went to Bhindi Bazaar and, and one of the wholesalers joked to me. He said, Madam, Indira Gandhi bhi aise hi bane the. Aap bhi ban jaoge. Aap bhi ban. Which was so funny. And, that's sort of, this was my first time in Bombay. For me, Bombay was all through Bollywood. And here I was living Bombay. And it was a blast because you know how Bombay is. You have this beautiful Pali Hill, and then
Yeah.
right next to it, there's a garbage dump.
Yeah.
In Delhi, the areas are more segregated. And yeah, that's what I did for 2 months in Bombay Metro as a sales executive. Through monsoon, wading through, forget knee high, through chest high water.
Water.
So, once you've done that, you learn how to engage with people. You learn how to, what the other person is looking for. And you realize that at the end of the day, everything comes down to relationships.
Yeah.
Of course, he'll buy this, shopkeeper will buy the Lux and the Lifebuoy and the surf he needs. But if, he welcomes this chance of speaking to a person, or the person has some ideas to give in terms of how he can dress up the window, or maybe can suggest something, maybe they can run a, sort of a display scheme together. But if I can add to that person's interface with me in that day, there's a reason for the person to engage with me.
Yeah.
And that learning is essential, I think, in all our interactions. So I carry it through even when I'm pitching my books or trying to sell them. It doesn't go away.
Has it become easier over the years to sell your books? Because, although they're wildly different, there is a certain, imprint that you carry.
You know what? It would be much easier if I wrote just a kind of book.
Yeah.
Like if you are a
I'm sure.
literary writer, it's
Sure.
much easier. Like my publicist at HarperCollins, who's working on Girls in the City, tells me that when she talks about girls in the city, a lot of people are shocked. This is not like Radiance at all.
Yeah.
But no, it is not. I like to believe I'm a versatile writer, and I always tell people I like to think of myself as a miniature Spielberg. Spielberg does this phenomenal, he did Tintin and Jaws,
Yeah.
and then makes all these phenomenal movies, which is Lincoln and Schindler's
Schindler's
List.
List, of course.
And I really do believe that each story requires a certain vehicle. It has to be told in a certain
Yeah.
way. And Girls in the City could not have been told with the literary sort of avatar and voice of Radiance, because these are young women who are not particularly literary. Juhi has nothing to do with literature. So I
Exactly.
can't have her speaking in a literary voice.
Yeah.
She doesn't think like that.
Right.
So I do feel that, I have to write across genres because I read across genres. I enjoy it immensely.
Mm.
And it would be easier if I was a kind of writer, and then you can sort of pigeonhole people and say, hey, this
Lot
person writes
you.
this.
Yeah.
But I write what I enjoy writing, and I hope people will enjoy reading those stories and books.
No, they do. They do. And thank you so much, Manreet. It's been a really engaging conversation. And I'm so happy to have finally spoken to you. I think some of the work that you're doing is so remarkable. And especially, I think, just giving a voice to so many memories and to so many voiceless people through your work has been tremendous. Thank you so much for joining us and all the very best for both your trilogies.
Thank you, Kaveri. It's been lovely
Thank you
speaking
very much.
and for your kind words.
See you soon.
See
Bye.
you. Bye.